Prince Harry had entered the meeting expecting a difficult conversation. He was not prepared for the sentence that followed. With senior members of the royal household listening in complete silence, William delivered a military decision so unexpected that Harry stopped responding altogether. The Duke's expression hardened. His hands remained motionless, and for several seconds nobody spoke. This was not merely another family disagreement. It struck directly at identity, service, memory, and Harry's place within the monarchy. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Harry kept his eyes on William, as King Charles watched both sons across the table. The meeting concerned ceremonial military representation, meaning official military roles and appearances carried out by royals for the crown. That mattered because Harry believed his years of service might one day give him a path back into that world. William had reached another conclusion. The prince had already told the king that leaving the question unresolved would create another confrontation. William chose his words carefully, but he did not soften them. Harry would no longer be considered for honorary military appointments, ceremonial military representation, or formal military appearances for the crown. Those responsibilities would remain with working members of the royal family, meaning relatives who perform duties for the monarch. The decision was clear. Harry's military record remained his own, but his former royal military position would not return. Harry lowered his gaze. His jaw tightened, and one hand closed around the arm of his chair. For him, this was not simply about uniforms or protocol. Military service had given him something royal life rarely had: belonging earned through shared risk rather than inherited rank. Charles saw that pain immediately. The king also saw William refusing to retreat, and the father inside him collided with the monarch responsible for protecting the institution. William reached for a prepared briefing before Harry could object. The prince told his brother that nobody was questioning what he had done in uniform. The issue was whether personal military history could automatically create a future right to represent the crown. Harry finally looked up. He asked one question: was there any route back? William answered without hesitation. Military service and royal representation were now separate, and that separation was permanent. The Duke went still again, because now he understood the true force of the decision. Then Harry asked why William had chosen this moment to close the door. The prince paused. Charles said nothing. The reason reached back to one incident, and once Harry heard it, the argument would stop being about policy and become personal. To understand why William's announcement cut so deeply, the royal titles have to be stripped away for a moment. Beneath the protocol were two brothers who had both grown up, surrounded by military tradition. Both understood the symbolic power of service, and both carried memories of duty into adulthood. Yet one now stood at the center of the monarchy's future, while the other was being told that a door he considered emotionally sacred would never open again. Harry carried that wound more deeply than anyone could measure. His years of active service had given him a world where rank, discipline, responsibility, and performance mattered more than royal birth. That experience became part of how he understood himself. William carried a different burden, an honorary military appointment, meaning a ceremonial link between a royal figure and a regiment or branch rather than an operational command, represented duty to the crown rather than personal achievement. For the prince, that distinction had become impossible to ignore. Harry remembered comradeship, deployment, sacrifice, and the rare feeling of belonging without explanation. William remembered continuity, discipline, and the pressure of representing something larger than one person. Neither brother believed he was dishonoring military service. That was what made the divide so painful. They were protecting different meanings of the same institution, and each believed the other had failed to understand what was truly at stake. Charles felt the conflict pressing in from both sides. The king knew how much military identity had steadied his younger son, but he also knew the future monarch would eventually decide who could formally act in the name of the crown. Protecting Harry from pain now could weaken the authority he had spent years preparing William to carry later. Months earlier, the prince had already warned his father that leaving the issue undefined would create expectations neither man could control. Harry had interpreted that silence in the opposite way. To the Duke, every year without a final ruling preserved a possibility that military service might one day become a bridge back into selected royal duties. William's announcement destroyed that hope in a single sentence. When the meeting temporarily broke, Harry stayed seated while Charles rose slowly and rested one hand on the back of a chair. William reached the doorway, stopped, and looked behind him. The brothers held each other's gaze without speaking. The silence carried anger, grief, and something worse, recognition. Because this argument had not begun in that room. It had begun during one military remembrance episode, when Harry made a request William could not forget. And once that moment was revealed, the entire decision would look far less sudden than Harry had believed. Months before Harry froze inside that royal meeting, another encounter had quietly changed everything. There had been no shouting, no public humiliation, and no dramatic palace announcement. Instead, there was a request, a private conversation, and one sentence William could not forget. Those present moved on from the moment believing the disagreement had ended. William did not. For him, it became the point at which uncertainty over Harry's military relationship with the crown became impossible to sustain. Harry raised the issue before a national military commemoration at St. George's Hall, asking Charles whether he could attend in a formal royal capacity and wear military dress connected to his former appointments. The ceremony was intended to honor service and sacrifice, but the request carried wider meaning. A ceremonial royal uniform can signal an official relationship with the crown, not simply a person's past service. William immediately understood the danger. If Harry appeared as an active royal representative, the line between veteran and working royal could become blurred again. Harry heard the objection and stiffened. He told William that military sacrifice could not simply be switched off because his position inside the family had changed. The Duke kept his voice controlled, but the hurt beneath it was unmistakable. For him, the uniform represented years he had earned for himself. William heard something else. The prince believed personal history was being used to reopen a ceremonial role that no longer existed. William set his pen down and answered carefully. Nobody was questioning Harry's service, he said, but the crown could not keep creating emotional exceptions every time a military occasion arrived. The distinction mattered because royal representation carried institutional meaning beyond family feelings. Harry looked directly at his brother and replied that military events were the one area where the palace should always leave the door open. Those words changed everything. William did not answer immediately. The phrase stayed with him because it revealed exactly what he feared. Harry did not see the uncertainty as temporary. He saw it as a permanent possibility. Charles sensed the argument tightening and stepped in before either son pushed further. The king ruled that Harry could attend only in a private veteran capacity, meaning as a former serviceman rather than an official representative of the monarchy. The immediate conflict ended, but nothing had truly been solved. Harry pushed his chair back and left first. William remained with Charles, who asked whether one difficult request really justified permanent policy. The prince answered quietly that postponement would only reopen the same wound at every major ceremony. That was the moment the future decision began. William requested a formal review of military representation for non-working royals, and Harry knew nothing about it. Months later, the unresolved argument would return with greater force. Except this time William would have a completed decision behind him, and neither brother would be willing to retreat. Harry's silence did not last. Once the shock faded, disbelief turned into anger, and the room that had seemed quiet became charged with years of accumulated resentment. He did not challenge an aide. He did not argue over wording. He turned directly toward William and demanded that his brother explain why service had become something the palace could separate from identity. William remained seated, met his gaze, and answered without raising his voice. That restraint only made the exchange more explosive. Harry leaned forward and rejected the language of policy altogether. "Say it to me directly," he demanded. He wanted William to explain the decision as a brother, not as the heir. The distinction mattered because the Duke was no longer arguing about protocol. He was asking whether the years that had shaped him still meant anything inside his own family. William answered that nothing could erase those years. Ceremonial representation, meaning appearing officially for the crown rather than simply attending as a veteran, was a separate responsibility. Harry's anger cracked into something more painful. He said military life had been the one part of royal identity he believed family conflict could not touch. Now even that felt closed. William stiffened. The prince replied that every exception forced the monarchy to renegotiate boundaries Harry had already chosen to leave behind. Yet he stopped short of attacking his brother's record. He respected the service, he said. What he would not preserve was endless uncertainty. Harry pushed back harder. He invoked Diana, saying their mother would have understood why military belonging mattered so deeply to him. Charles moved at once. The king warned both sons not to turn her memory into a weapon against each other. His voice cut through the room because the argument had crossed from royal policy into a family wound neither brother could control. Harry then looked at his father and asked whether Charles had ordered the review. William answered first. "I did." The words landed harder than any briefing. The Duke could no longer blame faceless palace machinery. His brother had wanted finality, had requested it, and had carried it through. Harry rose abruptly, the legs of his chair scraping against the floor. William stayed seated for 1 second, then stood too. Charles placed a hand flat on the table and ordered them both to remain. Neither son looked away from the other. Then Harry asked the question that changed the argument again. If Charles was still king, how could William make a decision this final? The answer would reveal just how much authority the future sovereign already possessed, and force Harry to confront a reality far larger than this one military dispute. Harry had assumed the most painful part of the meeting was already over. It was not. William's decision mattered because it revealed something larger than one military disagreement. The balance of influence inside the royal family was shifting. Charles remained the monarch, but his heir was increasingly being trusted to shape the rules that would define the next reign. For Harry, the discovery carried a brutal implication. He was negotiating with the present king while confronting the standards of the future one. Charles finally explained why William had been allowed to lead the review. The question, he said, was not simply about one ceremony or one uniform. It concerned the long-term structure of royal representation and who would officially act for the crown. Working royals, meaning family members who regularly perform public duties on behalf of the sovereign, had to remain distinct from relatives living outside that role. Because William would one day inherit responsibility for that system, the king had authorized him to help shape it now. Harry listened, but the explanation did little to ease the sting. Charles picked up the briefing, read a line he already knew, and slowly placed it back on the table. The monarch avoided his younger son's eyes. That silence hurt because the Duke understood it instantly. His father disliked the emotional damage, yet still accepted the logic behind the decision. William did not look victorious. The prince looked tired. He told Harry that preparing for kingship sometimes meant drawing lines that damaged relationships he would rather protect. He respected his brother's military service, but he believed honorary military representation had to remain tied to active royal duty so the armed forces and the public knew exactly who spoke for the crown. Charles had pushed for one concession. The king asked that the wording explicitly honor Harry's service and veteran status, and William agreed. But when his father suggested a review after several years, the future king refused. Reopening the question later, he argued, would only recreate the same uncertainty and the same pain. Harry stared at William as the true shape of the decision became clear. The permanence had not come from distant advisors. It had come from his brother. Then William delivered the next blow. Instructions had already been circulated for upcoming ceremonial planning, and Harry's name had been removed from consideration for one future military-centered royal event. The decision was already moving through the system. Charles reached toward Harry as if to speak privately. The Duke stepped back. William saw it and looked away. The policy was now understood. The next blow would come when Harry discovered just how much had already changed without him. A royal decision becomes real, not when it is spoken, but when doors, schedules, invitations, and expectations begin changing around it. Harry discovered that difference almost immediately. Within hours, the emotional argument with William was being translated into practical consequences. A future ceremony he had privately hoped might provide a dignified military return was no longer available. No dramatic announcement accompanied the change. That made the reality harsher. The machinery moved calmly while Harry was still absorbing the wound. Harry received the revised planning note before he had decided what to say to anyone. Royal staff had been told that official crown representation at the coming Armed Forces commemoration would be limited to working royals. That term meant family members who regularly carry out public duties for the sovereign. The change mattered because it reached beyond one argument. Seating, processional order, uniform approval, and official listings would now place the Duke outside the formal royal delegation. Harry read the document alone. His expression tightened when he reached the line separating personal attendance from official representation. He folded the pages once and set them down. For years, he had imagined that a military occasion might offer a narrow path back into royal life without reopening every other dispute. Now even that possibility had been closed by language that looked calm on paper and felt brutal in practice. Charles felt the distance almost immediately. The king asked an aide whether his younger son had responded, and when the answer was no, he dismissed the room. The monarch understood that Harry's silence did not mean acceptance. It meant the hurt had moved beyond argument. William heard the same concern, but the prince refused to chase his brother with pressure or ceremonial promises. Harry then admitted in a private conversation that he was considering refusing every military-linked royal invitation. Attending without recognition, he said, might feel more humiliating than staying away. William was told of the remark and answered that nobody should force him to attend. The future king would not use an invitation as leverage, even if Harry's absence made the family division more visible. Harry stood beside the amended schedule with a pen in his hand, ready to write a response. He stopped. Then he placed the pen down untouched. Fight, withdraw, accept. None of the choices felt clean. Charles could see where the silence was leading. The king arranged one final meeting with no aides, no briefing papers, and no officials to absorb the anger. This time, William and Harry would face each other only as brothers. Policy had already created the separation. Now they had one chance to decide whether it would destroy what remained between them. When Harry entered the smaller room, there were no secretaries waiting, no constitutional papers arranged on a table, and no king positioned between the brothers. William was already there alone. For the first time since the dispute began, neither man could hide behind office, hierarchy, or protocol. The decision would not be reversed. Both knew that. What remained unresolved was something more human. Whether William's judgment meant he no longer respected the part of Harry's life that had mattered most to him. Harry stopped a few steps inside, waiting for the usual language of policy. William refused to use it. The prince said Charles had arranged the meeting, but deliberately stayed away because the king believed one thing had already been settled and another had not. Royal policy, meaning the rules that govern who formally represents the crown, was finished. Brotherhood was not. William told Harry that excluding him from future military representation did not erase a single day he had served. Harry finally said what had been buried beneath the anger. He could survive losing titles, formal privileges, and ceremonial access. What he could not accept was the feeling that the institution had taken his military history, used it when convenient, and then decided it no longer belonged to him. The Duke's voice tightened. William listened without interrupting, and for once, the future king did not answer with structure or precedent. William admitted he had handled the first confrontation badly. The prince said Harry's service belonged to him permanently and required no palace approval to remain real. He should have said that before talking about representation, because policy language had made a boundary sound like an erasure. Yet he still would not reverse the decision. Restoring ceremonial privileges, William explained, would create expectations of gradual return, then another bitter fight when the next limit appeared. Harry absorbed that slowly. The Duke still believed his brother was wrong, but he could finally see the motive more clearly. William had not been trying to punish him. He had been trying to replace years of uncertainty with one painful line. That understanding did not heal the wound, but it changed its shape. Harry then made his choice. He would attend the coming commemoration privately as a veteran, not as an official royal representative. William extended his hand. The Duke looked at it for a moment, then accepted. Neither brother embraced. Neither surrendered his position, but they had stopped trying to defeat each other. For both brothers, that difference mattered, because respect had returned without agreement or surrender. The conflict, however, had already escaped the palace. Harry's next appearance would turn their private reckoning into a national judgment. By the morning of the military commemoration, the argument was no longer merely Harry versus William. It had become a national debate over service, duty, royal status, and whether personal sacrifice should remain separate from institutional privilege. Commentators prepared for confrontation. Cameras waited for signs of humiliation. Yet the moment that captured public attention was far quieter. Harry arrived without ceremonial military dress, took his place among veterans, and offered no visible protest. The image transformed the emotional meaning of William's decision almost instantly. Harry stepped from his vehicle knowing every movement would be judged. He paused, took a breath, and joined the veterans without answering shouted questions. Broadcasters explained that William's policy barred him from acting as an official ceremonial military representative of the crown, while leaving his veteran identity untouched. Formal royal representation means appearing on behalf of the sovereign, not simply attending in a personal capacity. The Duke understood the difference, though accepting it still hurt. Charles had already ordered palace communications to remain restrained. The king wanted briefings to respect Harry's service while making clear that official representation belonged to working royals. William watched from the royal party as his brother entered separately, and the prince's expression tightened. He knew the physical distance between them was partly the result of his own decision. For the future king, clarity had come with a human cost that policy could not hide. Harry's arrival changed the tone of the day. A morning newspaper ran a front page showing him among fellow veterans in a dark civilian suit, while the royal party appeared apart, under the headline, "Service Without the Crown." The image captured exclusion and independence at once. Instead of the humiliation many commentators expected, viewers saw restraint. The Duke had accepted the boundary without surrendering the meaning of his service, and William's decision suddenly looked less like erasure and more like separation between personal history and institutional role. William noticed the reaction too. The prince had expected criticism, but not this strange balance of sympathy for Harry and understanding for the policy. Charles saw the same shift and allowed the silence to stand. No statement was needed. The public had interpreted the moment for itself. Harry removed his commemorative wreath pin as the ceremony ended, held it briefly, then placed it in his pocket. He did not discard it. He kept it. That small act said what the entire dispute had struggled to express. Royal representation could be withdrawn, but memory could not. Then Harry and William crossed paths away from the crowd. The public had seen separation without collapse. Now only one judgment remained, and it would come from the brothers themselves. In the end, William did not reverse the decision, Harry did not pretend it no longer hurt, and Charles did not magically repair years of tension between his sons. Yet something important had changed. The conflict began with Harry freezing because he believed a final piece of his identity was being taken away. It ended with a different realization. The crown could decide who represented it, but it could not decide whether his years of service mattered. That distinction became the emotional settlement. Harry understood that the military framework would remain exactly as announced. He would not return to honorary military representation or perform ceremonial duties on behalf of the crown while living outside the working royal family. Those duties are official appearances carried out for the sovereign, rather than personal acts of remembrance. The distinction mattered because the Duke could still attend veteran commemorations, support military charities, and honor the years he had served without needing royal office to validate that part of his life. Harry admitted privately after the commemoration that waiting for selected privileges to return had kept him emotionally tied to a future that no longer existed. The acceptance hurt, but it also ended years of uncertainty. William reached a different realization. The prince understood that preparing for kingship required hard boundaries. Yet he also recognized that clarity without compassion could turn necessary decisions into deeper wounds. Charles spoke separately with both sons afterward. The king told Harry that nothing about the ruling changed his pride in his military record. Later, the monarch told William that the future sovereign had the right to create durable rules for the crown he would eventually lead. For the first time, the father stopped trying to make those two truths cancel each other out. William met Harry once more away from the formal party. "What you did in uniform is yours. This was never about taking that from you." The Duke paused before answering. He still wished the decision had been different, but he understood it now. There was no dramatic reconciliation, no sudden restoration of trust, only recognition. Harry turned to leave. William did not call him back. The Duke stopped, gave his brother a small nod, and continued forward. The prince returned it. The silence no longer carried hostility. It carried acceptance. Harry had lost a royal military role, not the meaning of his service. William had drawn a permanent institutional line, and Charles had finally accepted that family affection could not depend on endless royal ambiguity. The argument ended because each man understood what belonged to the crown and what belonged to the individual. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.